Hello, everyone, and welcome to MAP Forum. I'm Nagar Rokar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. And today I'm delighted to have Professor Elizabeth Lehfeldt with us, who is a professor of history at Cleveland State University. Her most recent publication, titled Contrary to Reason, which is the subject of today's talk, just won the prize for the best article published in volume 18 of Early Modern Women and Interdisciplinary Journal. So we're very, very happy to have her with us today, who is going to share her insights on this publication with us. Thank you, Professor Lehfeldt, for being with us today.
Great, thank you. Let me share my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay, there we are. Okay, so I want to thank the organizers of the MAP Forum for the kind invitation to be part of this series. I'm really excited to share this work today. This is part of a book-length project on convent households in early modern Europe. And it begins with a provocation. I am arguing that we need to stop centering enclosure when we talk about female monasticism in this period, not because it didn't exist, but because our methodological focus on it may be obscuring other opportunities to analyze the lived experience of female monasticism. Hence the title of my talk, Beyond Enclosure. But why beyond enclosure? Over and over again, the archives spanning geography and chronology have offered scholars stories of resistance to enclosure in the late medieval and early modern convents. Take, for example, this case of the Cistercian convent of Valdoncea in 1494. The male ecclesiastics sent to the convent made it clear to the nuns that the reform would include the observance of strict enclosure. The abbess immediately objected and said that what the visitors were proposing was contrary to reason. This is where I get the title of my article. As part of the same reform campaign, the abbess at the Franciscan convent of Pedralbes said that sometimes necessity required that she and the nuns leave the cloister, but that in allowing this, she acted according to God and conscience. At the Benedictine convent of Saint-Père, the visitors resorted to threatening the abbess with excommunication when she resisted. She, too, would assert that she was guided by her conscience. Read across the scholarship of convents in the last 20 years, of which there's been much, the list of these sorts of exceptional anecdotes is now quite lengthy. From the late Middle Ages well into the 17th century, nuns throughout Europe squared off against individuals who sought to restrict their movement beyond the cloister. These same archives also offer abundant evidence of nuns leaving the convent uncontested for a variety of reasons that could include visiting relatives, begging for alms, managing estates, offering solace to lay women and kin, and visiting sister convents. That such behavior was uncontested suggests it was customary and unremarkable. Two possible enclosure narratives have emerged from this evidence. First, there are stories of virtuous male ecclesiastics imposing a disciplinary standard on lax and obstinate nuns. The second narrative casts the male ecclesiastics as interfering authorities, imposing unwanted standards on nuns who already adhered to particular standards of virtue. But my question is, when do we reach a tipping point with all of these anecdotes? Methodologically, we need an intervention when the weight of these anecdotes exceeds the anecdotal. But in order to offer that, I think we need to consider why these enclosure narratives have been so powerful and what they have allowed. So there are essentially, our focus on enclosure has allowed two powerful narratives to shape our scholarship. The first is the naughty nuns narrative. We know that monastic corruption did exist and can imagine the need to enforce enclosure. But I would argue that there's also a bit of dramatic tension to these narratives that's informed by a fine tradition that dates back to at least as far as Boccaccio's Decameron, meant to entertain us with stories of disobedient and corrupt religious figures. So the narrative that sees virtuous male ecclesiastics returning recalcitrant and worldly nuns to a higher standard of monastic discipline is a compelling one. The second narrative is valiant nuns. Read as the disconnect between theory and practice, historians have argued in favor of valiant nuns, resisting the imposition of a distinctly gendered discipline by a patriarchal and male ecclesiastical hierarchy. The narrative arc of this analysis adheres to a fairly consistent script in the scholarship. Male ecclesiastical visitors would appear at a particular convent. These visitors would come to impose a particular reform agenda. Whatever their remit, they typically investigated the observance of enclosure and insisted on stricter standards. The nuns, who up until this time had probably operated largely unfettered by such demands, resisted and asserted their autonomy, typically citing tradition, custom, the interpretation of their religious rule, and the financial burdens as the reasons they rejected enclosure. Usually the nuns accepted some changes but negotiated for modifications. In rarer incidents, intransigent convent officers were removed and reform was imposed without any adjustments. Examples of resistance like these have created a dramatic narrative where nuns, often relegated to silent and contemplative roles, become significant actors resisting patriarchal norms. These narratives then have a dramatic power that has spilled over and become the primary analytical lens through which we understand early modern convents. And I think we need a way forward. As compelling and even accurate as these narratives have been, they remain focused on the anecdotal. Thus, it is time to see what the focus on an accumulated body of anecdotal resistance to enclosure and the undergirding assumption that it was normative have obscured about the realities of convent life in early modern Europe. And let me move to presentation mode. So if we move beyond enclosure, I've argued in a recent article for 3 new analytical frameworks for the study of late medieval and early modern convents. Methodologically, each of these frameworks will require turning away from prescriptive sources and documents of practice and looking toward other sources such as spiritual biographies and account books that may more fully reflect how nuns experienced enclosure. One framework analyzes the generative power of enclosure when nuns and convents themselves chose and deployed it to particular ends. Another framework investigates the use of enclosure not as a standard of monastic discipline, but as a political tool wielded by monarchs and other political actors. The final framework, the one I'll be talking about today, examines the complexity of the convent household, focusing on the multiple actors, lay sisters, lay boarders, stewards, notaries, doctors, priests, ecclesiastical visitors, and others who regularly moved across the thresholds and doorways of the convent. So to turn to the question then of the convent household, I want to start by asking what we mean when we say household. For scholars of early modern Europe, the household is a familiar structure. It's a convenient shorthand, right? I say household and you know what I'm talking about. The household was a social unit centered around the family. But we know, of course, that the composition of the household was not limited by kinship ties, but could include servants and apprentices and other non-familial individuals. The household was bound by affective relationships among its members, but also by hierarchies. Typically, the head of the household was male, the paterfamilias, and all other members were under his authority and owed him obedience. The household was also an economic unit of production. As such, it had a rationale, sustaining itself, meeting its obligations, providing goods and services. Conceptualizing the convent as a household both overlaps with and challenges these definitions and characteristics. As a social unit, the convent might house members of the same family. We have numerous examples of sisters and nieces and aunts who all resided in the same foundation. But choir nuns were customarily from different natal families and bound through spiritual kinship instead. Like their secular counterparts, convents additionally expanded the definition of household to include servants and personnel who provided essential services. The convent, too, was an economic unit. While dedicated to the obligation of prayerful pursuits, convents also managed vast estates. Their ability to meet their spiritual obligations depended upon their fiscal stability. And in a curious gender twist, ultimate authority in the convent household resided not in a paterfamilias, but in the person of the abbess, a woman. Today, I want to explore three categories of household members: lay sisters, lay women who boarded at the convent, and male personnel. Analyzing the convent as a household challenges us to consider the ways in which nuns formed relationships with individuals who were not nuns, and as a consequence permits insight into a greater cross-section of early modern society. It also allows us to imagine how these relationships shaped the use of convent space. The presence and movement of all of these people complicates the notion of the convent as a protected and removed environment. So using a range of sources, this project analyzes the role of these individuals and traces the resulting affective geographies of the convent household. I'll start with the lay sisters and a quote from Teresa of Avila. Writing about her travels to found new Discalced Carmelite convents in Spain, she spoke of, quote, a lay sister, a companion who has for some time been going about with me. She is a great and discreet servant of God who can help me more than others who are choir sisters. This is from her Book of Foundations. These lay sisters were women who served the convents, did not take formal vows, but nonetheless participated in the spiritual life of the community. The vocation, and I use that word deliberately, of lay sister appealed for two possible reasons. The first was financial. Lay sisters did not have to meet the dowry requirements of solemnly professed nuns. This opened the possibility of a religious life to women of lower social status. The second reason, which likely overlapped with the first, was spiritual. We know that lay sisters participated meaningfully in the devotional responsibilities of the convents, but their prayerful contributions were modified. A set of 17th century constitutions for Franciscan convents, for example, specified that the lay sisters should observe the divine office, but would say fewer paternosters at the appointed hours. Thus, we should allow that some women chose to be lay sisters because it afforded the opportunity to live a life of religious devotion without the more advanced liturgical trappings and even literacy required of choir nuns. It also potentially allowed these women greater mobility. Although practice varied widely, in some instances, lay sisters maintained a presence beyond the walls of the cloister. At the convents of two different orders, the Franciscan convent of Santa Clara de Villafranca and the Hieronymite convent in Barcelona in the late 15th century, for example, the lay sisters collected alms for the community, a role that offered opportunities for ties to the secular world. Lay sisters also sometimes used this vocation as the first step on the path to professing as a choir nun. The companion that Teresa of Avila described in the quote just a moment ago was none other than Ana de San Bartolome, who would go on to take formal vows and played a defining role in the expansion of the Discalced Carmelite order. If these were the motivations of women who became lay sisters, what role did their fellow nuns envision for them in the convent household? As we've already seen, the flexibility of the lay sisters' vocation allowed them to provide services to the convent, such as collecting donations. Lay sisters also often performed more menial tasks, contributing their labor to the kitchen and infirmary. Historical precedents for this role and the place of these women in the female monastic community can be traced to the use of lay brethren in the Cistercian order and St. Clare's designation of, quote, sisters who serve outside the monastery. Even when the tasks were less menial, there might be distinctions. In Florentine convents, for example, as professed nuns began to work increasingly in textile production involving silk, the work of servant nuns was relegated to the less fancy production of linen textiles. This hierarchy of labor was echoed by other hierarchies. We've already seen that lay sisters had modified liturgical duties, perhaps to make space for what they provided to the convent household. Additionally, they were routinely instructed to wear a different habit. In 17th century Spanish Franciscan convents, they were supposed to wear a white veil instead of a black one. Further, they were not allowed to vote in chapter meetings. The combination of these hierarchies with the typically lower social status of the lay sisters undoubtedly shaped the relationships that the nuns formed with them. Choir nuns might have expected deference and obedience from the lay sisters. In addition, because they performed much of the cooking and cleaning around the convent, there was often a temptation to treat them as servants. As one scholar has noted, these women occupied an uneasy space and were simultaneously lay nuns and professed servants. Teresa of Avila worried about this dilemma as well in her instructions to male visitors of Discalced Carmelite convents, warning that, quote, almost all the prioresses are fond of having many lay sisters, and the houses become filled up. There were concerns that convents would create scenarios whereby the nuns each had a lay sister assigned to them and would treat them as personal servants. Male ecclesiastics in other orders shared Teresa's concerns and settled on what became a common formula of no more than one lay sister for every 10 nuns. But we should avoid the temptation to assume that the negative tensions that might adhere to such hierarchies always colored these relationships. If we return to Teresa of Avila's remarks, we find evidence of affection and reliance. She spoke warmly of a companion who traveled at her side. It is clear from Teresa's letters that she relied heavily on lay sisters to help populate and manage the convent she was rapidly founding. The care taken with admitting these women into convent households also reflects a desire to ensure a good and stable fit. The acceptance of lay sisters required a secret vote and majority approval from the professed nuns. In addition, prospective lay sisters underwent a one-year trial period before formally entering the community. While we might be tempted to read these regulations as guardrails designed to keep women without a true vocation from becoming lay sisters, I think we should also consider the possibility that these were community building strategies that sought to orchestrate harmony and compatibility. We can find all of these tensions reflected in the life of Dionysia, a lay sister whose story is narrated in a spiritual biography of a different woman, the founder of the female branch of the Capuchin order in Spain. To begin with, it is striking that Dionysia's life receives two lengthy chapters in this volume that runs to just a little over 250 folio pages. Even the abbess of the convent where Dionysia served only merits one chapter. Dionysia's story is a complicated underscoring of both the deference and humility expected of her and praise for her piety and contributions to the convent community. After several years as an unenclosed beata or holy woman, Dionysia, under the direction of her confessor, entered the convent of the Capuchin sisters in Girona. Explaining that lay sisters had the obligation to accept obediently whatever role was thrust upon them, her biographer praises her selfless work in the convent kitchen, a position that she accepted with quote-unquote great humility. He then goes on to laud her extraordinary piety, relating that she often spent hours on her knees in prayer while working in the kitchen. He further highlights the connection she formed within the convent, extolling her exceptional work with the sick and noting that many in the community sought her comfort and care. Dionysia is the ideal lay sister, humble, prayerful, and beloved by her community. The archives of Spain's convents also tell a rich story of secular women who called the convent home. Most of these women came to the convent as adults. We have long known that the convent was a haven for lay women who chose the safety and respectability that the cloister could provide. But what did this look like in practice? To begin with, it probably looked and felt crowded. In 1579, the convent of Santa Isabel in Valladolid housed 4 lay women. In 1637, 5 laywomen called the Valladolid convent of Santa Maria de las Huelgas home. In both cases, this was in addition to at least 20 nuns who also resided in each convent. These women are named specifically and their social rank is specified. This is significant for what it reveals about the practice of accepting these secular borders. Overwhelmingly, the enumerated women are identified as doña. While the concept of noble status had become decidedly more flexible in the early modern period, with families buying their status, an honorific, such as doña, connoted status. And the fact that some women are not identified with it suggests that the distinction mattered. Yet not all were doñas. The convent could also be a home for laywomen of lesser status, like Constanza de Cunha at Santa Isabel and Jeronima Gonzalez at Las Huelgas. The presence of these laywomen added to the bustle and fabric of life within the cloister. For male ecclesiastics, however, these borders were a potential source of disruption. They wanted to limit the influence of worldly concerns. A set of constitutions issued by the General Chapter of the Franciscans in 1639 exhorted convents to avoid, whenever possible, having lay women live with them because of the quote unquote great troubles that resulted from this practice. In the same breath, however, the constitutions acknowledged two scenarios by which convents could allow their presence: if there was urgent and grave cause, or if the individual in question was of great quality, a nod towards noble or high-class status. In all cases, the abbess had to secure permission and the candidate had to be examined by the provincial. Once admitted, the women were supposed to dress modestly and avoid irreverent clothing and head coverings. The abbess was to ensure that their rooms were at a remove from the nuns so that conversation between the two groups could be contained. Notably, for understanding the impact on convent space, the constitutions identify the places where these women lodged as pisos, or apartments, suggesting that they were larger than simply a cell and/or the possibility that they included more than one room. Significantly, the decision to admit laywomen was at least partially at each convent's discretion. As already noted, urgent circumstances or someone's status could provide an exception to the general rule. When presented with a laywoman seeking entry, the constitution cited above instructed the nuns to take a secret vote, and that only with the approval of the majority could a laywoman take up residence. So what might have prompted a community to vote in the affirmative? While the presence of these women vexed ecclesiastical authorities, it enriched the lives of nuns in tangible ways. In her will of 1499, Maria de Zuniga, a secular woman who had held an apartment or piso in the convent, left the community of San Quirce an annuity contract and funds for the convent infirmary. In return, she requested a memorial mass be said for her each day. Laywomen also paid the convents for these apartments. Our ability to track their presence, in fact, comes largely from the footprint they left in convent account books, where the nuns tallied the sums that they paid as rent. This expectation was underscored by texts like the Constitution cited above that specified that the abbess should collect the amount that she assessed as appropriate, taking into account whether or not the laywoman was also boarding with a servant, for example. It is possible then that convents may have sought secular boarders as an economic strategy. Doing so, however, would have required matching the convent's financial needs with the motivations of these lay women. So it is worth exploring those as well. The most common pathway was the one pursued by widows. Life within the convent preserved and protected the precarious autonomy that widows possessed. Living alongside the nuns demonstrated piety and propriety. It may also have been a way of protecting property and its administration. As Maria de Zuniga's will demonstrates, she maintained control of her resources and willed them to the convent in exchange for masses. These were women with resources, the doñas identified in the account books, and the women of great quality identified in the constitutions. And these women could even use their entry into the convent as lay women as a stepping stone to eventual profession. Such was the case with Doña Catalina de Rojas y Porras, the widow of a local rope maker, who eventually professed at the convent where she had boarded. Curiously, her will of 1664 continued to identify her as a seglar de piso, a secular woman in an apartment, begging the question of whether she continued to lodge in her laywoman's apartment even after taking formal vows. But we also need to account for women of lower social status not identified as doña who called the convent home. Perhaps these women fell into the second category noted in the constitutions, that of urgent and grave cause. We know that convents could be a refuge for women fleeing bad marriages or other constrained circumstances. Here, the convents made deliberate choices about offering care and charity, literally opening their household to outsiders, these women in need. In a world where lay women had limited choices when hardships, personal or financial, hit, the convent offered an alternative household and the opportunity to anchor oneself in a community of women. As a consequence, lay women were not anonymous lodgers. They formed relationships with these communities. Women like Maria de Zuniga remembered their convent homes fondly and generously when they drafted their wills. Women like Catalina de Rojas y Porras felt compelled to take vows and join these communities formally. And we should also acknowledge the deliberate community building that the nuns performed in welcoming these women. While in some cases the convents may have relied on these borders as a source of income, they were also empowered to make choices about who joined them. In their voting, convents also weighed questions of compatibility and charity, choosing who they wanted to live alongside them and to whom they wanted to extend care. Sustaining this community of women, choir nuns, lay sisters, secular boarders, and allowing them to fulfill their responsibilities required managing complex estates in order to maintain financial viability. Like secular households, convents were economic units with responsibility for rich portfolios of agricultural land, rental properties, annuity contracts, and other investments. So that brings us to male personnel. Convent officers had significant authority and autonomy over these estates and finances, but again, like their secular counterparts, they needed people to help them manage these estates. And they relied upon male stewards, bailiffs, and notaries to perform important tasks. These individuals collected rents, transferred payments, negotiated disputes, authorized contracts, and helped conduct a convent's business outside its walls. Many of them came from modest backgrounds and held no title or university degree. So here too, their interaction with convents permits insight into a broader cross-section of early modern society who we might not otherwise encounter were it not for the archival traces they leave in the convent record. As with lay sisters and secular boarders, there is much yet to be learned about the relationships convents formed with these individuals and how their interactions with them shaped the use of convent space. These were hierarchical relationships. Bailiffs, stewards, notaries, and others were salaried employees of the convents and carefully selected by them. These were decisions made not solely by the abbess, but by the entire community. In 1615, at the convent of Santo Domingo in Uclés, the prioress put forward the name of Pedro Martinez to be the new steward. She had chosen him, quote, for being capable for this office and being the brother of the priest of the Holy Church, who is the confessor of the nuns. Ultimately, he was selected, but very interestingly, the decision was not unanimous. 6 nuns voted against him. These relationships were also carefully monitored. The comportment and actions of these men reflected on a convent's reputation and contributed to their financial success. So convents kept tabs on them. In 1538, the convent of Nuestra Señora de Belén in Valladolid, for example, filed a lawsuit against the widow and children of its former steward in an effort to retrieve rents that they believed had not been turned over to them. Convents maintained administrative control, but would also have needed to develop strong and cooperative working relationships with these individuals in order to ensure the success of the convent household. Unlike lay sisters and secular boarders, whose presence was often commented upon by ecclesiastical visitors, stewards, bailiffs, notaries, and others are more difficult to physically locate within the spatial life of the convent. Account books and other financial records track their employment and the work that they performed, but where and how did they interact with the nuns who used their services? Did these interactions take place at the torno? Pictured here, an example of one, the revolving window that was a feature of many early modern convents. Did these interactions take place in the visiting parlor, or what Spanish convents called the locutorio, or in other locations? The records of various transactions provide some clues. For example, the record of a profession of a nun at Nuestra Senora de Belén in Valladolid in 1524 notes that it took place in the presence of a particular notary, Diego Fernandez. Another example, when the nuns of Santa Clara in Valladolid gathered to invest a steward with the power to oversee some of their financial interests, they recorded the names of the nuns who were present, and then the document notes that by this letter we hold and we bestow all our complete power to you, Juan Montero, resident of this town, who are present. A third example, in the accounts of the Dominican convent of Santa Catalina in Valladolid, the abbess signed a payment, the receipt of a payment, noting that she received the sum of 5,000 maravedis by the hand of the steward. All three of these examples suggest a kind of physical immediacy and proximity. And I would argue that such immediacy suggests a point of contact that is not the torno, that is not the revolving window. In addition, the complexity of convent finances points us towards the need for more involved and detailed conversations that I don't think could have taken place at the torno. A review of the finances of early modern Spanish convents reveals complex and complicated patrimonies that included all different kinds of investments. Convents and their male representatives managed a range of interests scattered across diverse locations and involving literally hundreds of individuals. Take, for example, the case of the Franciscan convent of Santa Isabel in Valladolid. Here, an account book captures the extensive administrative obligations of the steward Matias de Robles, who had the responsibility of collecting annuity payments from 74 different individuals and corporate entities. These payments varied depending upon the original contract. Contracts remained active even if the original owner of the contract died, and so the steward was often tracking down and collecting payments from their heirs. While these annuity contracts were a really common financial mechanism in early modern Spain, managing such a vast quantity of them would not have been without complications and wrinkles. In the same accounting period, the same account book made note of 26 annuity contracts for which the payments were still owed. The torno, the revolving window, would suffice for the purely transactional, money and papers passed back and forth, but surely anything more complicated, like accounts in arrears or needing to adjust the terms of a contract, would have required conversations between the abbess or a different convent officer and the steward about the details of this work. So what implications would these have had for the use of convent space? So here, I think the locutorio, the visiting parlor, is a likely candidate as a meeting space for these more complex conversations. The locutorio was often configured as a two-sided space with secular visitors on one side, separated by grill work or a curtain that limited their ability to see or touch the nuns on the other side. But it was definitely a space for more than just visits from families. So a few examples. At Santa Maria de las Huelgas in the early 17th century, a notary certified the profession of two nuns at the grill in the locutorio in the presence of 5 male witnesses alongside the abbess, all of whom signed the document. And the same document noted the presence of all of the other nuns who witnessed this particular event. In 1629, the same convent signed an agreement with the city of Zaratan, over which it held seigneurial jurisdiction. The abbess, the prioress, and the male representatives in the case were all present in the locutorio and signed the document. But sometimes other, even more intimate spaces are cited. The 1524 profession that I described just a moment ago that took place in the presence of a notary is also detailed as having taken place in a sala baja del dicho monasterio, in a lower room of the same monastery. And if they had meant the locutorio, they would, I think, have used that word. A century later, 1624, another profession was a carefully orchestrated event marked by a series of steps and transitions involving various convent locations. And I'll sort of walk you through the process. Having been previously asked by a local ecclesiastic if she was ready to make her profession, the woman in question, Isabel Camargo, gave her responses. These were verified as accepted by a notary and were presented in the convent's visiting parlor in the locutorio to the prioress. Following this, the prioress opened the puerta reglar, the door that marked the entrance to the cloistered part of the convent. The novice Isabel entered, and then she and the 4 witnesses, the prioress, 2 male ecclesiastics, and the notary appeared in the area on the other side of the door, the porteria, and the novice declared her intention to profess. At that point, she was covered in a black mantle, and in the company, and the notary records it, quote, "and in the company of me, the notary, and the said witnesses," end quote, she was taken out of the porteria and further into the interior of the cloister. And all of the witnesses followed along, and then they all witnessed her being asked her profession questions again. We know all of this because the apostolic notary, who despite his title is not an ecclesiastic, recorded these events, noting that they happened ante me, before him. So here we have a case of 3 men, one of whom was not an ecclesiastic, entering the cloistered space well beyond the locutorio. All of these examples of the presence of male personnel help us to round out our understanding of the convent household. Not just home to nuns, lay sisters, and secular boarders, the convent household relied upon and even required the presence of these men to ensure its smooth functioning. So all of this brings me to a few conclusions. If the spatial parameters of the cloister were not as fixed as previously assumed, the presence of individuals, male and female, secular and religious, in convents is less about transgression and more about what constituted a convent household. Convents customarily welcomed and housed a variety of individuals, and getting too caught up in the enclosure narrative of either naughty or valiant nuns risks missing the richness and meaning of these interactions and relationships. My hope then is that by removing the methodological weight of our focus on enclosure, we might see the vibrant, bustling, and sometimes even crowded contours and features of the convent household. Doing so illuminates the affective geographies of the convent, the points of contact and relationships that convents formed with individuals whose voices we might not otherwise hear, were it not for their archival traces in the convent records. In turn, we deepen our understanding of the lived experiences of the nuns themselves, who are not cut off from us by the assumed boundaries of enclosure. Thank you.
Thank you for this fascinating presentation. Now the title makes much more sense to me. Thank you so much for taking us through all the details. And you mentioned that this is part of a bigger project, a book project. Sorry, you can take your time. In the meantime, I can also invite everybody to write their questions in the Q&A in the chat so that I can read them to you. So yeah, can you elaborate a little bit on this project, and what part of the entire project is this presentation?
Sure. So it starts with this sort of pushback on the idea of enclosure, and not that it doesn't exist, because every time I say that, somebody tells me a story about something they found in the archives about enclosure, and of course it exists. But I just worry that it's kind of obscured some other things. So the book project then I want to look at all of these various actors. I mean, I gave you 3 examples today: the lay sisters, the lay women boarders, and these various male personnel. I hope too to do some work on the various male ecclesiastics who come in and out of the convent, and the ways in which they have the capacity to kind of shape the use of convent space, the relationships that they form with the nuns. I think the danger of seeing all this through the lens of enclosure suggests that every time there are these points of contact, it's transgressive. It's not what's supposed to be happening. But in fact, I think the nature of the people who are there, the people whose services the nuns need, means that they do form relationships with these people. And these relationships are not defined by transgression. They're defined sometimes by affection, sometimes by need, sometimes by cooperation in the case of the male personnel that the convents rely on. So the larger project wants to look at all of these various people and the relationships they form with the nuns, the impact on the use of convent space, and then also how the convent manages all of this. I think there will also be a chapter on convent officers sort of being in charge of all of these relationships and the use of space.
Thank you. Wonderful. So we already have two questions in the Q&A. The first is by Brian Sandberg. Thanks for your presentation, Liz. I like the notion of rethinking convent households as variable and dynamic. I am going to have to run for teaching, but this is a comment that Brian left, and if you want to elaborate on this as well, and that would be great because yeah, I do agree that this is an interesting notion.
Yeah, so yeah, to me too. This idea of household, again, I think we use it as a shorthand a lot, without really unpacking what that means, even if we're talking about more sort of natal family, nuclear family kinds of households. So yeah, I'm really curious what it means to have a household where a woman is in charge, as opposed to a father figure, the pater familias. So I think that raises some interesting questions. I think it raises questions about the kinds of relationships that get formed in these units, for lack of a better word, because again, household is a shorthand, but I'm not sure we always entirely know what we mean when we say that. I think it lets us, as I touched upon, talk about these units as having an economic rationale. And I think convents are no different in that regard. They are certainly spiritual institutions with very serious spiritual responsibilities, but they need to be able to sustain themselves to meet those responsibilities. And so I think seeing them as economic units, which lots of people have done, but we've not necessarily called them households in that context. And so, and again, household then lets us talk about these other people who serve the household, who create
Right.
the household.
Absolutely. I do have a question about of this, but we have another question by Christine. How do these lay sisters in Spain compare to their northern European equivalents like Beguines or spiritual maidens?
Yeah, so I need to do more work on that. I need to get a better sense of the variety of this vocation because it's really hard to pin down. I think people want there to be like a script for lay sisters, and there really isn't. So I know more about the Italian example, which I think is more similar to the Spanish example than not. But I need to get a sense of the variety of these types of women. They seem, I don't know, I'm of two minds on this. Some of it, as I noted, is specific to particular religious orders. I mean, Clare is very clear for the female Franciscans. She has a really specific category in mind when she talks about these sisters who serve the community. Later, people who take Clare's ideas and do things with them have their own ideas about that, but it is grounded particularly within the Franciscan order. That said, I think there's room to explore the similarities across religious orders. I very deliberately gave the examples I did of the lay sisters going out to collect alms from two different religious orders, the Franciscans and the Hieronymites, to sort of underscore the fact that even though the role that these women play or their place within the convent household may be specific to their religious order, that there are some characteristics that seem to cross religious orders. And I expect the same would be the same with the geographical variety, that we would find some similarities, but we would also find things that were particular to the geographical context.
Wonderful. The next question is by Nicole Hill. You mentioned that in some cases, nuns shared convent households with members of their family. I'm curious if that ultimately permitted more freedom for individual nuns because of the familiarity they shared with each other. Outside of your research, I wonder how that might have impacted their families outside of the convents.
Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, there is a kind of chain migration that goes on sometimes in convents. So, your aunt is in a convent, and you, the niece, join that convent because she's already there. Chances are perhaps good that you've gone and visited her over your lifetime. You've gone to the locutorio to visit your aunt, the nun, and that sort of thing. And so that there is a sense of familiarity. And if you have a vocation, it might be easier to launch that vocation somewhere where there's a familiar face, and those sorts of things. It doesn't happen a lot. I mean, I have isolated examples of sisters or an aunt and a niece and that kind of thing. It definitely, though, cements the family's ties to that convent. And it's often the case that there's a lot of patronage and donations that follow from those kinds of connections. So, if there are two sisters or if there are an aunt and a couple of nieces, that's going to be very meaningful for that particular family. Because as I've argued in other work, families really form these attachments to convents because of the proximity that it gives them
Mhm.
to the spiritual, and because of the intercessory responsibilities that those female relatives then have, for their souls, literally.
Right. The next question is by Laurie. Thank you so much for your meticulous work. How much do you feel that the understanding of household, in parentheses, or familia, and the practices that govern, that is common from diocese to diocese, even from convent to convent or decade to decade? I really like the idea that we could have a more capacious term that is almost deliberately fuzzy rather than something that is sharply delineated.
Okay, can you go back to the beginning? What was the
Yeah, you
first?
actually have access to the
Oh, okay,
questions. It's
sorry.
in the Q&A.
Let me
Yes.
see.
So
Yes.
scroll down to Laurie.
Yes, I will. I will. Okay. Yes. Oh, perfect. Okay, good. Okay.
Yes.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Um, okay. Okay. Yeah, that's what I thought the question was. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of variability, but I actually, your question was about, are there any sort of consistent rules to to how we sort of talk about a household or a familia, or that sort of thing from diocese to diocese? I suspect there's a lot of variability. I'll be honest, a lot of and you probably, if you were, sort of listening, I kept talking about this set of Franciscan constitutions, the set of Franciscan constitutions. So I have these Franciscan constitutions from the 17th century that have a lot to say about lay sisters and secular women boarders. But that may be very particular to the Franciscans. Again, I think there's some overlap. I've seen some Benedictine constitutions that are similar, but I like your idea of capaciousness, and I wonder if we might be able to start to realize that each convent creates its own household, right? That they have to play within certain parameters, within certain sets of rules, these constitutions, their religious order, that sort of thing. But that maybe local circumstance does matter, right? I mean, when you're making the decision about which lay sisters to admit, which secular boarders to admit, and I'm really struck that these are secret votes in chapter meetings, that maybe each convent really does build its own household, right? Based on
Mhm.
these very empowering and individual choices that they make.
Mhm. Right. Interesting. Next question is by Elizabeth Fama. Early in her marriage, when Maria Salviati was upset by a specific incident and her husband was away on a military campaign, she entered a convent for a short time. Would it have been simply a spiritual retreat? would she have become part of the convent household if it was clearly a temporary stay? Would her stay have required a donation of goods or money? How common were temporary retreats like this in your studies?
I've seen a lot of it. I do think, I mean, I focus today on these women who are paying rent, who are clearly there for a period of time. But no, I think there are lots of examples that I've seen, and not just for Spain, but in the secondary literature on other convents, where the convent is a kind of temporary refuge for women for whatever reason. We see it a lot with royal women in Spain, that they go there for a period of time and then they leave. Again, for various reasons. So no, I think it can be a temporary home. So I think in that sense, they do not become a permanent part of the convent household. I think, sort of a temporary member, but we can imagine secular households where people didn't stay permanently and, came for a period of time and then moved on. Apprentices, for example, would be one. And I suspect some sort of donation was required. It'd be interesting. I've got lots of records from account books. It would be interesting to go through those with an eye towards that, and try to see if I could match those sorts of donations with people who stay for a shorter period of time.
Interesting. Laurie actually rewrote her question, so if you want to refer to that, but I think you already covered the points. The next question is by Lena. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. You mentioned that the sisters were working silk and the lay women worked flax. Is it possible to find out more about different specific textile work, like bobbin made gold borders in 1600 in Florence or other Italian areas?
I will be honest, my example of that comes from Sharon Strokia's excellent work on Florentine convents. So there may be some of those details in her book on that subject, but that is the extent of my sort of textile knowledge as far as Italian convents are concerned.
Thank you. Wonderful. And now we finally get to my question, uh, which is I understand that you're a historian, and my question is more about like the art history of this subject. So how do you think that the visual culture in those convents, such as the devotional artworks or the architectural design, or the decorative programs in general, reflect that kind of relationship between the nuns and the broader social networks that engaged with these spaces?
Yeah, so actually, I'm going to real quick share my screen again because I didn't have a
Sure.
chance to say anything about it, but there was a painting in one of the early slides. Hang on. That captures some of that. Oop.
Yeah, we just
Okay,
yes.
so this is a painting of the Virgin and Child and the nuns of this community. This is the convent of Santa Ana y San Joaquin in Valladolid. And I mean, people who do our history, you've already, I'm sure, figured out that the people in the lower part of the painting are the patrons, right? These are the people who are
Right.
to
Yes.
the convent. So we see a lot of this. I'm struck in this one by how many nuns there are represented. I mean, it's not uncommon, I realize, but I think these kinds of decorative programs are not unusual in turn, and it links them then to these patrons, people who might have come to the locutorio, who might have been part of the convent space, the side chapels in convent churches, which all essentially belong to various families, and then contain the decorative programs that they choose, is another way that this gets represented. I'm also really intrigued, and I didn't include it in the presentation here. Let me stop sharing. At how, and this isn't your question, but it is a question about sort of art and what we mean by household and family, how religious orders understand the concept of family. There's this really interesting painting that I saw earlier this spring from Santo Domingo de Silos, which is a monastery, a Benedictine monastery, but it is a family tree, an arbol genealogico, of the Benedictine order. And I was sort of fascinated by it because I think it was a way for this community, this monastery in this case, but I still think it has bearing, to represent a sense of family, maybe household, not in terms of like St. Benedict showing up in their house, but that sense of community, that sense of household represented pictorially.
Mhm. Interesting. And do these like special dynamics also reflect the gender roles within the household?
I think that's possible. Yeah, that's not something I've thought about. Like I would be curious, I'd be curious to find a Franciscan example of something similar that might show Francis and Clare, one of these orders where we've kind of got a male founder and a female founder, and see what that might have to say about gender.
Okay. Lena actually has a follow-up question. Would you please write the author and title you refer to? I could not catch it.
Sure,
I think Sharon Sirke.
yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Yes, thank you.
I don't know the exact title of the book, but if you Google her book on Florentine
Is it
convent.
Sharon's book?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. We actually hosted the author last year. And gave a talk on this topic, so I might be able to, if you email me, Lena, I put our email contact information in the chat. If you email me, I'm able to recover the recording to that talk and then share it with you, if that is helpful. So my very last question, I know we only have 4 minutes. I do have other questions, but I skip those. But what kind of primary documents are you working on? Can you elaborate a little bit on your
Sure.
research methodologies?
Sure. A lot of this is account books. Convents kept meticulous records, and a lot of this comes from account books, which are, this is the income that's coming in, and these are the sources, these are the payments that are going out, these are the expenditures, the things we're spending money on. So that's where I see, for example, the rents paid by these secular women or the salaries paid to the male personnel. All of that information about the various spaces where these interactions with the male personnel are taking place are from individual contracts or records of various transactions. So whether it's the profession of a nun or an agreement with the city that they have seignorial jurisdiction over, or some sort of transaction that requires the presence of a notary, or requires a notary to literally notarize, authorize the proceedings. So these are very sort of individualized transactions. Some of this is coming from the records of convent chapter meetings. So like when they vote on that steward and that sort of thing, that's from the record of chapter meetings. Ecclesiastical visitations have a lot of this information. Those have to be read carefully because the visitors are usually a little bit hostile to what's going on within the convent, but we can glean a lot of information from what they're upset about. Like the lay sisters aren't wearing the habit they're supposed to be wearing, or something like that. So mostly archival records, and then also these spiritual biographies, I think, are kind of interesting. That example that I gave of the one lay sister, I wasn't expecting to find her story. I was reading it to read about this abbess, and then there were these 2 chapters all about this particular lay sister. So happy accident.
Wonderful. Yeah, of course. Yes. Any scholar would dream of this moment. But thank you so much. We're running out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your research with us. We cannot wait to read the book.
Me too.
Yeah.
No, and I want to say thank you for the invitation to participate, and thank you to everyone for their questions. This is a new sort of fresh project, and you've all given me lots of good things to think about. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. I personally enjoyed your presentation and the Q&A afterwards, because we got a lot of good questions. So that was very dynamic. So thank you so much again for joining us. And thank you everyone for being with us for the last hour. Please join us again next week, same time, same Zoom link for every week. We're going to have Susan Naramore next week. So please join us again. Thank you so much. and hope
Thank
to see
you.
you
Take
again
care.
next week. Bye bye. Take care. Have a good evening. Bye bye.